Welcome back to the Old Soul Millennial channel. In today's video, I'd like to teach you how to replace the exhaust manifold on a GMC Terrain with the 2.4 liter Ecotec motor. Now the car behind me that we're going to be working on is a 2014 model, and something a little bit unique about this car, or special about this car, is it has the California emissions nonsense on the backside of the motor. What does that mean? Well, you'll see here shortly on the backside of the motor there are some air injection lines and some electronic valves. And it just means there's going to be more things that we're going to have to remove in order to get to the exhaust manifold. Now, most other GMC Terrains out there will not have this emissions stuff on the backside of the motor because it wasn't a California specific car. And that's a good thing because that just means this job's going to be a little bit easier for you. However, if you do have the California emission stuff on the backside of the motor, no big deal. I'll show you how to remove it and we're going to get it done. So what are you going to need for this job? Well, you're going to need a new manifold. I bought mine from Amazon. It included the manifold, new gasket where it mates to the block, and there's also, looks like a ring, and I believe that's for where the exhaust bolts onto the catalytic converter downpipe. Additionally, it came with a few other nuts and bolts. I also decided to purchase a new stud kit because I'm not sure what condition the manifold studs are going to be in, so we do have the option of replacing them if need be. The manifold bolts were a little expensive. They were like $35, but what are you going to do? So how do you know if you have a cracked exhaust manifold? Well, really the best thing to do is to visually inspect it. So what I would recommend is watch the first part of this video, learn how to remove everything, and get to the point where you can visually inspect the manifold. Look to see whether there's a crack or not. And it's very common on these cars for these manifolds to crack, especially to the right of where the upstream O2 sensor screws into the manifold. But aside from that, some other signs and symptoms that you either have a cracked manifold or an exhaust leak somewhere along the exhaust system of the car. For one, you may smell exhaust in the cab. That is the case with this car, especially when it's not moving, when it's stationary. Those exhaust gases will rise and they will find their way into the cab. But you know, when the car gets underway and it's moving, those exhaust gases tend to go underneath the car and they tend to stay out of the cab. So that's something to pay attention to. But you need to do a proper diagnosis here. You need to visually inspect this because there may be another exhaust issue somewhere else along the exhaust line. I know for a fact on these cars, the exhaust, well, the muffler tends to split. And I actually have done a muffler repair on this car, had to weld it back together. It's very difficult, but I was able to get a successful result. I knew that there was a split in the muffler. For one, it was really loud, but additionally, when I was underneath the car doing an inspection, I saw a lot of soot on the underside of the car, which indicates that, you know, exhaust gases were hitting the underside of the car. So that's just a tip and something to pay attention to. Now, another symptom of a cracked exhaust manifold would be upon startup, and while the engine's running, it sounds a little bit louder. You know, so I'd recommend opening up the hood, start the engine, and listen. Does it sound like a little bit louder than what it should be? It's a good sign that you have a cracked exhaust manifold. So without further ado, let's get started. Now the first thing we need to do here is to remove the airbox. We need to remove this EGR line out of the airbox, and you can do this by gently wiggling it and pulling it. It should come right out. Loosen up this hose clamp right after the mass airflow sensor, 8mm fastener. And we can pop this hose out of here. It's going to be a little bit difficult to see, but if you look down in the engine, right above the throttle body, there will be another hose clamp, another 8mm fastener, so we're going to have to loosen up that clamp. Now at this point you will be able to remove the airbox, so my method, start in the front, lift up, pop the lower connection out of the throttle body, and then I like to work this to the left, and then to the right, pops right out. Let's protect the throttle body with a glove, ensure no debris get down into the engine. The first thing I do is take this exhaust recirculation line, gently bend it out of the way and put it underneath this cover. Next, temporarily remove the oil fill cap, put that off to the side. Then you're going to have to lift up and just pop this out. Also turn this over and ensure you have the grommets on the backside. There's 1, 2, 3. There's number 3. Sometimes those grommets will pop off or fall into the engine or stay stuck on the nub, so just pay attention to that. And just going to reinstall the oil fill cap. We are going to have to remove some electrical connections, so as a measure of safety, I would recommend disconnecting the battery, which I'm going to do that now. So we're going to need to move the ECM out of the way in order to access the battery. So this cover should slide right off. This one's broke, that's why it was zip tied on. Then there's going to be a 10mm fastener right here, so we're going to remove that fastener. And then this ECM will slide towards the outside of the car, and we will just lift this up, move it out of the way, and then we have access to the battery terminals. I'm going to disconnect the negative terminal, 10mm lug. Let's loosen that up and put this off to the side. So what we need to do is we need to start creating some space back here, and the first thing we really need to do is to get this harness out of the way slightly. Now, I have not disconnected anything yet, but what I have done is I've taken a body clip removal tool and I popped out some of these Christmas tree holding clips. I'll show you which Christmas tree holding clips that I have popped out. So there's one here, one that goes directly into the valve cover, and there's 3 other clips that I popped out here. So there's one clip for this large connector, there's an upper clip over here, and then there's a lower clip down here. And this, it just gives us some leeway with this wiring harness. So on the back side of the motor, you can see these air injection line actuators. There's one right here and one right here. There is a single electrical connection going to each actuator. So at this point in time, I'm gonna pop these connectors off of the actuators. So now that we have these 2 actuators disconnected, I'm going to take the wiring harness and I'm going to lift it up and pull it forward slightly. I'm going to try and bring it up over this ball, which this ball is for the engine cover. So we're just going to get it out of the way. Do the same thing on the left side of the engine. There's another little ball right here. Just lift this up and pull it forward slightly. And if you want, you could disconnect everything and pull this out of the way even further, but I think we're going to have enough clearance there. All right, we're starting to get into the tricky part of this video. So my recommendation, have a few different size 1/4-inch ratchets. If you got a bunch of different extensions, maybe a swivel, you're probably going to need all of that. So what we need to do now is we need to remove this bracket. This bracket is held onto the block with 2 13mm bolts. And if you take a look at this stud right here, that 13mm fastener is right to the left of it. I'm using a 13mm 1/4-inch drive ratchet. Kind of see where I am. Just gonna remove this 13mm and then we'll remove the 13mm on the other side. Now we need to remove the other 13mm fastener for this bracket. So if you follow the right side of this bracket and just follow it down, you can see where it bolts into the block. I have 1/4-inch drive ratchet, 4-inch extension, 13mm socket. I'm gonna sneak this around these 2 tubes right here. I will probably need 2 hands. There's our 13mm. Get my hand out of here. And let's pull this bracket out of here. So I have the camera focused on the left, the passenger side air injection line actuator. Here's one of the lines that feeds this actuator. So let's pop this line out. Should be able to pinch right here and pull this out. Comes out pretty easy. We really should protect that, but I'm just worried about getting this actuator out of here right now. Now the back side of this actuator, there's going to be 2 13mm bolts. You could faintly see one right there, and there's one off to the right, deeper in the back here. I'm going to try a 1/4-inch drive, 13mm deep socket. So you can't see it, but for that second 13mm fastener, I have a 1/4 inch drive ratchet, 13mm deep socket. Got her loose. Should be able to spin it out the rest of the way by hand. Alright. That is one actuator. You can see where the second bolt is. So off camera, I popped this hose out of this actuator. It's the same procedure for the left one as it is on the right side. And same thing, we're just gonna have to remove these two 13mm bolts on the back side of the actuator. 1/4 inch drive, 13mm deep socket again. Not much room back here, but it's doing the trick. So once I get those bolts cracked loose, I normally switch to 13mm on a little extension here. This just makes it a lot easier to spin these bolts out by hand. Here's our second actuator, and be mindful because there are gaskets on these actuators as well. We're just going to reuse these, but save these, make sure you don't drop them down into the engine. Alright, now we need to unplug and remove the upstream O2 sensor from the manifold. So you're going to have to uncouple this electrical connection, and it's a little bit annoying. You basically have this gray secondary lock, and these two wings kind of expand out, so you got to try and get in here with a pick and push them back in. I got a 45-degree pick, and that seems to be the tool right there. I think we have it started. Pulls out all the way, and you have the main connection. So you just lift up, pull, should pop out. So we'll put this line out of the way. Now that O2 sensor, that may give you a little bit of trouble. Now I had this out the other day when I was diagnosing the crack, so mine isn't going to be too bad. My recommendation, if you do have trouble getting that O2 sensor out of there, get yourself a butane torch and sneak it down in here past the heat shield and try and heat up the manifold around that O2 sensor. Heat it up for a minute, try and remove it, and then just repeat the process if you can't get it out the first time. I ended up using a 1/2 inch breaker bar to remove the O2 sensor the first time. And to remove this O2 sensor, you are going to need a O2 sensor removal toolkit. They're fairly inexpensive. You can see it kind of slides down over the wire, and that way you can get the socket on the O2 sensor itself. So hoping this won't give me too much of a problem right now. 1/2 inch breaker bar with a 4 inch extension, maybe it's a 3 inch extension, not sure, but this is what I did the other day and it worked. I'm trying to be careful with the lines here, but there she goes. So what I'll do is I'll give it, a 1/4 turn and lift up that socket, reset it. There's our O2 sensor. So after you remove that O2 sensor, you need to remove the heat shield. And I believe there's two 10mm fasteners. Clearly there's this one right here. 1/4 inch drive, deep 10mm. So that heat shield has a second 10mm fastener holding it on. That is towards the passenger side of the car. And that is the fastener right there. So I'm just gonna back the camera out just so you can get an idea of where it is. If you follow that U-tube right there, if you feel the bottom part of the pipe and then you just reach directly for the block, you should be able to feel that 10mm. So to get that second 10mm, 1/4 inch drive, small extension, deep 10mm socket, back of the ratchet's right against the firewall, but we got her cracked loose. So I was unsuccessful in removing the heat shield. There's just not enough clearance, so it looks like we're just going to have to try and get these air injection manifolds out of here. I think I'm going to have enough clearance to do it. It's just hard to see what's going on. The GoPro helps out a little bit, but we have a 13mm stud. We need to remove that nut. Same thing on the other side right here. Now these are two separate tubes and they kind of crisscross. And they also bolt on the other end of each tube into the block. So, I mean, it's going to be difficult, but I'm really going to have to reach down in here and just get this done. So I believe all these are going to be 13 mil. So let's just start removing these nuts and figure it out. So getting these air injection lines out of here is definitely going to be the worst part about this job, but I think I kind of have it figured out. By the way, if you're doing this job, definitely consider investing in a topside creeper through some moving blankets in the engine bay, but my chest is getting sore, I tell you. So you're definitely going to need a mechanic's inspection mirror. Here's my recommendation. Clamp it on somewhere in the engine so it does not move. See, I have it clamped on and I have it fixed. So what we are trying to get at is the lower bolt on the air injection line. And you can see I have that bolt in focus right now, and that is a freaking bear to get to. The camera's going to be shaky, but this is some good information, and this is the worst part about this job. So now to get to that bolt, it's tricky. It's definitely tricky. I think I have it figured out though. I have 1/4 inch drive, 10 mil on a swivel with a 6-inch extension. And what I'm doing, I'm just looking in the mirror and I'm gonna sneak this down here and I'm gonna try and get it onto that bolt. I think this is the best way to access that fastener. There's really not much information out there. See, I got a good bite on it right now. So I'm going to put the camera down, just focus on getting the lower fasteners out of here. We're going to have to repeat the same process on the other tube. So there's two 10mm fasteners that bolt into the block, and then I think you have that 13mm nut on the stud. That's easy. The 10 mils are hard, but I'm going to give this a try and we'll get her out of here. All right, we pretty much have the same thing going on. I have the inspection mirror clamped on, and we have maybe that 6-inch long extension, swivel, and then a short 10 mil. And I don't think you're really going to be able to see it on camera because this side's just so difficult to see what's going on. But I did get that lower 10 mil cracked loose. It is turning. So I'm just going to focus on getting this out of here. And then with any luck, we should be able to remove those air injection lines completely. Alright, I think we have everything loosened up. We should be able to remove both of these air injection lines now. There's one. There's two. What a bear. So I got both these air injection lines out of here. Man, what a bear. I'm really hoping that's the worst of this job though. I just want to make a note that you should label each one of these pipes so it goes back together smooth and you don't get everything mixed up. For example, this one is the right, so this is going to be on the right here. Now this one is going to have 2 bolts, but if we flip this over and look at the left pipe, I'm calling this the left pipe, the lower fastener, right, this is deeper down in the engine, is going to be that 10mm bolt. And the upper one's going to be a stud, and then later on this bracket ties into the stud and it helps support the other air injection line. So another thing I want to note real quick, the bolts that go on these air injection lines, they actually should have a little piece of plastic. Right, so there's like a little holding piece of plastic, so when we go to reassemble everything, the idea is that little piece of plastic will hold the fasteners in place and steady long enough for us to get in there and try and thread them back into the block. Ugh, it's going to be a nightmare getting these back in, but we have no choice. You got to get it done. Also, just a final note, keep an eye out for carbon buildup in here. There was a little bit of carbon building up right here and I knocked it out. See all that? Yeah. So just make sure these are clean before you throw them back in. So now we still have this heat shield in the way. I'm going to try and get it out of here. I think we'll try and rotate it slightly and then try and pull it up. There's our heat shield. And you should pretty clearly be able to see the crack in that manifold there. Now it's time to remove the manifold. I believe there are 10 13mm nuts holding this on, so let's get to work. Alright, so we're making good progress here. I believe I removed all the nuts where the manifold bolts into the head. I've also removed the nuts where the downpipe connects to the catalytic converter. So the issue I'm having now is I don't have enough wiggle room to remove this manifold from the catalytic converter. So I could try and get in here with a pry bar and separate this a little bit, but I'm probably going to have to go underneath the car and lower the exhaust a little bit. So let me look into this. Alright, so underneath the car, hopefully you can see it, that's where the cat comes down. There's a bracket and a bolt, which I would suspect that to be a 15mm bolt. So I'm going to remove that off camera and then I'll meet you back up top side where we should have enough wiggle room to separate that manifold from the cat. Welcome back to the Old Soul Millennial channel. I just spent 2.5 hours removing this broken exhaust manifold stud on, this is a 2014 GMC Terrain with 2.4 liter Ecotec motor. I'm doing a full repair video showing you how to replace the exhaust manifold on that car. If you do want to watch that video, look in the video description down below and I will leave a link for that video. But the purpose of this video, the sole purpose of this video, I want to talk about how to remove a broken exhaust manifold stud without the use of a welder. Now traditionally, welder would be my go-to device for removing broken studs. I'd weld on a washer onto that stud, and then I would weld a nut onto that washer, and then traditionally I'd be able to extract those broken studs no problem. Issue with this car, the exhaust manifold's on the back side of the motor, and there's not enough clearance to get my welder back there. And another issue is I couldn't get my head around the back side of the motor to see what was going on. So, first thing you're going to need, if you can't see what's going on, you're going to need a mirror. This is a camping mirror. This is like a 5x7 mirror, and I would not have been able to do this job without this mirror. I'll leave a link for this in the description down below. It was like $6 or $7. So my next thought, all right, I'm going to drill out that stud and I'm going to use one of these bolt extractors. These bolt extractors did not work for me, which I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second here. But so when you're drilling the exhaust manifold stud, the first thing you're going to want to do is get a nice sharp center punch and tap a centering hole on that stud so that way you have a place for your drill bit to start. I started using a pilot bit, however the pilot bit broke off, so my recommendation, go right to 1/8 inch. Have a nice sharp 1/8 inch drill bit and just start drilling a little bit and stop, just make sure you're centered, but I'd go right to 1/8 inch because those small pilot bits, they tend to break, and then you're going to be up, you know what's creek. So, aside from that, my traditional battery operated drill did not have enough clearance to get around the backside of the motor, so I had to purchase a right angle low profile pneumatic drill, and this really did the trick. This is a cheaper model. It works very well, however it does not have a trigger lock, so every time I was fishing this around the backside of the motor, almost drilled into my hand a few times. So I would recommend you investing in one with a trigger lock if at all possible, but definitely get one that has reverse as well. This one's relatively cheap, but it did the job just fine. So I was able to drill that stud out a good way, and then I tried one of these tapered bolt extractors, right? Now this tapered bolt extractor bit in a little bit, and then it kind of popped out. This really did not work for me. I was really disappointed with these, so I went back to the drawing board. You know, one of the keys to removing a broken exhaust manifold stud is to not rush the process. Take your time, think methodically, ensure that you're backing everything off the right way, yada, yada, yada. But again, these didn't work for me. So I did some research online, and a lot of people recommended try taking a Torx bit and hammering it into the hole. And that's exactly what I did, and that's actually what worked for me. So for an 1/8 inch hole, typically you're going to want a T20 Torx bit. Now this is what I ended up hammering into that stud. So this is a bit adapter to 3/8 inch drive, and basically I just held this and I took a hammer and I hammered this onto the stud, hammered this into the hole that we drilled in the stud, that 1/8 inch hole, and sure enough, that was able to get enough of a bite as to where I was able to actually extract the broken stud. And you can see it's actually pretty well formed to that T20. I'd also recommend that you have a T25 on hand, because if you strip the T20, you can grind this down a little bit and get a little bit more bite out of the T20, or you can move up to the T25. But another little trick I have for you as well, before you start hammering your T20 into the hole on that broken stud, put a little bit of heat on the block around that bolt. Just use this little butane torch, heated it up for, I don't know, maybe a minute, something like that. You can always add more heat, you don't want to overdo it, but you know, a little butane torch, just heat up that area, helps loosen everything up, because I think a lot of these studs do have Loctite in them, and then of course you have the corrosion that builds up between the stud and the block, but that's what worked for me. Enough yabbering on, it's time for me to put my money where my mouth is. So I'm going to share with you now the video clips I recorded of me extracting that stud out of the motor, and enjoy. All right, here's the workstation. I don't have a topside creeper, so I'm just using a bunch of blankets and a pillow to get down in here. You can see I have my mirror positioned down against the firewall, and I can adequately see what I'm doing now. So let me position the GoPro down in the engine, and we'll start drilling out these studs.
Ever.
Tell me about it.
What?
Tell me about it.
Like, my veins stopped producing blood. She put the needle in, she goes, there's no more blood coming out. I'm like, what do you mean there's no more blood? Did my body run out of blood or something? She's like, why isn't there blood? I'm like, I don't know. And she moves the needle while it's in my arm, and now my arm is killing. But she was able to get enough so she didn't have to stab my other arm, which is nice.
So I'm pretty well exhausted. I've shown you how to remove all these components. Additionally, I've shown you my method as to how I removed 2 broken exhaust studs. What I'm getting at is I'm pretty much done filming. You just basically reassemble everything in the opposite order. The only other thing that I do want to point out is if you take a look at the block, this is the gasket that goes on the block. You're going to notice these 2 ports here and these 2 ports here. I believe that is where the air injection lines go into the motor, and 2 of those ports were pretty well clogged with carbon. I was able to get in there with a pick and pick a lot of that carbon out of there. So if you do have the air injection lines, pay attention to that. Ensure that you pick all that carbon out of there and blow it off really well with a wand afterwards. But yeah, I'm gonna go have some lunch, take a little break, play some music. We're gonna put this back together, and then I will turn the camera back on when we are ready to start her up. All right, so I just finished up here. I have not started the car yet. I wanted to do that on camera, but before we start the car, I just want to go over a few final tips I have for you. Now, total time it took me to complete this job was about 10 hours, but I was figuring out a lot of this stuff as I went along here. The tips that you've learned in this video will definitely make this job a bit easier, but this is a pretty darn difficult job. I'd give this an 8 or 9 out of 10. The most difficult part about this job was reinstalling the fasteners for those air injection lines where they bolt onto the block. And this is what I ended up using. Let me try and get the camera in focus here. So getting that lower fastener in is just going to be a nightmare. I have this mechanics grabby tool, right? There's this flexible handle, and then you just pull the top to release the fastener. But come on, camera. I just dropped this down in the engine kind of sideways, and then I was able to push the bolt into the head, and from there I was able to get a 1/4 inch drive swivel 10 mil onto the end of the bolt, and I was able to thread it into the block. So this is going to be one of the most challenging portions of this job. Another tip I have for you, there may be an instance or two where you're going to want to have your 10mm socket holding onto the end of the bolt, and you're not going to want that bolt to pop off. So here's what you do. Just take some electrical tape. Sorry, the focus is awful right now, but just take some electrical tape, wrap it around the head of the bolt, and that will hold that socket onto the end of the bolt, and then it won't fall out until you're ready to pull it out. Then you just take the electrical tape off, and should prove to be helpful at some point in this job, especially with the reinstallation of the air injection line. So without further ado, I'm going to hop in the cab and start it up and see if it sounds any different, any quieter. Much quieter. Much quieter. Much quieter. There's no rattle upon startup. Not hearing that loud rah, 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 rah sound coming from the engine. And most importantly, there's no more exhaust smell in the cab. There's a little bit of residual oil that's just burning off, which that's normal after a job like this. But I just want to show you the exhaust manifold one more time. Let me see if I can find a crack. So here's the crack right here. But additionally, we had 2 broken studs, and that was causing the exhaust gas to blow to the side of the manifold and the head, just blow out to the side. So I think our issue was definitely a combination of the 2. Long, difficult job, but well worth it. Thanks for watching. Catch you on the next one.